Even today, more than a century after the First World War ended, farmers in northern France still uncover artillery shells in their fields. Entire regions remain contaminated with unexploded ordnance. Specialists are called in every year to remove tons of munitions that never detonated. Forests are fenced off. Construction projects are delayed. The ground itself remains dangerous. That is the legacy of industrialized artillery. During the First World War, more than 1 billion shells were fired. Entire landscapes were erased. And for the men who endured those barrages, survival often depended not on courage or skill, but on chance. Everyone has seen the photographs: endless mud, shattered trees, trenches carved into the earth. But photographs cannot capture the sound. When the war began in August 1914, European generals believed it would be short. Most armies had prepared for a campaign lasting weeks, perhaps months. Ammunition stockpiles were calculated accordingly. Offensive spirit, maneuver, and rapid movement were expected to decide the outcome. What few fully understood was how modern artillery would dominate an industrial war. By the early 20th century, artillery technology had advanced dramatically. Rifled barrels increased accuracy and range. Breech-loading systems improved rate of fire. But the most significant breakthrough was the recoil system. The French 75mm field gun became a symbol of this new era. Its hydraulic recoil mechanism absorbed the backward force of firing, allowing the gun to remain in position and maintain aim. Crews could fire rapidly without relaying the weapon after every shot. Instead of a handful of rounds per minute, guns could now sustain astonishing rates of fire. Multiply that by hundreds of batteries across miles of front, and the scale becomes clear. In the opening months of the war, German heavy artillery demolished Belgian forts that had been considered impregnable. Massive siege guns reduced concrete structures to rubble in days. Fortifications designed over years were destroyed in hours. In open battle, artillery proved equally decisive. During the Battle of the Frontiers in 1914, French infantry advanced in dense formations under the belief that offensive courage could overcome firepower. German observers directed concentrated artillery fire onto exposed troops. The results were catastrophic. The war of maneuver quickly became a war of entrenchment. Machine guns and artillery made movement across open ground nearly suicidal. Armies dug into the earth. What began as shallow defensive positions evolved into vast trench systems stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Artillery became the dominant arm of the conflict. Pre-war planners had assumed that each gun might fire 1,000 rounds over several months. In reality, some batteries expended that amount in days. Within weeks, ammunition shortages plagued all major powers. Governments reorganized entire economies to feed the guns. Factories expanded rapidly. Production multiplied many times over. Women entered munitions plants in large numbers, working long hours under dangerous conditions. The war had become an industrial system of destruction. But what did this mean for the men under bombardment? To be shelled was to live in a state of constant uncertainty. High explosive shells detonated with enormous force, sending steel fragments outward in all directions. The blast wave alone could rupture lungs or cause internal injuries without visible wounds. Shrapnel tore through flesh irregularly, creating devastating trauma unlike the clean penetration of a rifle bullet. Early shells sometimes buried themselves in soft ground before exploding, but impact fuses were later refined to ensure detonation upon contact. Barbed wire was shredded, timber supports splintered, sandbags disintegrated. What made these shells even more destructive was the evolution of explosives themselves. By 1914, many armies had replaced older black powder charges with far more powerful high explosives, such as TNT and picric acid. These compounds had been developed in the late 19th century, originally for industrial and mining purposes. In wartime, their destructive potential was fully realized. Picric acid, used by several European armies, was highly effective but chemically unstable. Improper storage or contamination could cause premature detonations. Later in the war, mixtures like amatol, a combination of TNT and ammonium nitrate, allowed nations facing shortages to stretch explosive supplies while maintaining destructive force. These developments increased both blast pressure and fragmentation effect. Shells no longer simply exploded. They shattered into thousands of high-velocity fragments capable of cutting through sandbags, timber, and flesh alike. The chemistry of industrial explosives had transformed the battlefield into a landscape of controlled devastation. Dugouts offered some protection, but even these could become tombs. A direct hit might collapse the ceiling, burying men alive. Survivors described clawing at earth with bare hands in desperate attempts to reach trapped comrades. Sometimes they succeeded, often they did not. There was rarely warning. Some shells traveled faster than the speed of sound, meaning the explosion came before the distant report of the gun. Others emitted a rising whistle that grew into a scream before impact. Soldiers learned to distinguish between calibers by sound alone, but recognition offered little safety. One shell might land meters away and fail to detonate. The next could strike directly overhead. Prolonged bombardments lasted for days. During major offensives, artillery fired without pause. The ground trembled continuously. Sleep became impossible. Hearing damage was common. The air filled with smoke, dust, and the metallic smell of explosives. Men began to exhibit symptoms that doctors struggled to classify. Trembling, paralysis, inability to speak, uncontrollable panic, conditions later known as shell shock. At first believed to be caused by blast pressure, it became clear that relentless psychological strain could break even those who bore no visible wounds. Entire units were rendered ineffective by mental collapse. Gas shells introduced another layer of horror. Earlier in the war, chlorine gas had been released from cylinders, dependent on wind direction. Artillery delivery changed everything. Gas could now be targeted precisely. Phosgene caused delayed lung damage. Soldiers might feel little immediate effect, only to drown internally hours later as fluid filled their lungs. Mustard agent burned skin and eyes, contaminating trenches and equipment for days. Under such conditions, even conventional high explosives seemed, at times, merciful by comparison. Artillery tactics evolved in response. Early offensives relied on prolonged preliminary bombardments intended to annihilate defenders before infantry assaults. At the Somme in 1916, days of sustained shelling preceded the attack. Yet deep dugouts allowed many defenders to survive and emerge once the barrage lifted. Later innovations included the creeping barrage, a moving curtain of fire advancing just ahead of attacking infantry. Soldiers were trained to follow closely behind exploding shells, trusting timing and coordination. Advance too slowly, and defenders would recover. Advance too quickly, and one risked being struck by one's own artillery. At Verdun, millions of shells were fired over months. The landscape became unrecognizable. Craters overlapped craters. Bodies were obliterated or permanently entombed beneath churned earth. At Passchendaele, relentless bombardment destroyed drainage systems, transforming fields into seas of mud. Men drowned in water-filled shell holes. Artillery reshaped not only tactics, but terrain itself. Behind the lines, artillery crews faced danger as well. Counter-battery fire targeted enemy guns. Through sound ranging, flash spotting, and aerial observation, opposing batteries were located and struck. Ammunition dumps exploded violently. Gun crews worked under constant threat. Serving an artillery piece required relentless labor. Shells were heavy. During intense operations, crews loaded and fired hundreds of rounds per day. Gas attacks forced gunners to operate while wearing masks, reducing efficiency but necessary for survival. And yet, as dangerous as life was for those manning the guns, it was worse for those trapped beneath them. The scale of shelling left another enduring consequence: unexploded ordnance. It is estimated that a significant percentage of shells failed to detonate. With more than 1 billion rounds fired during the war, that meant vast quantities remained buried in the soil. Even today, specialists in France and Belgium collect and dispose of tons of First World War munitions every year. More than a century later, artillery shells from the Great War continue to injure and kill. The horrors of World War I artillery were not confined to a single battle or a single weapon. They were the result of industrial firepower unleashed without precedent. Modern chemistry, mass production, and military doctrine combined to create a battlefield where destruction was constant and survival unpredictable. By 1918, artillery had become the decisive arm of modern warfare. For the soldiers who endured its bombardment, death most often arrived not from a visible enemy, but from above. And in the trenches of the First World War, survival depended on something no amount of training could guarantee: coincidence.